On March 12, 2004, in a quiet neighborhood of Fresno, California, what began as a custody dispute would reveal one of the darkest family secrets in American history. 9 bodies would be discovered that day. 9 lives ended in a back bedroom. But the horror of what happened inside this house began decades earlier, with one man's twisted interpretation of religion, family, and control. This is the story of Marcus Wesson, a man who turned his family into a cult, his daughters into wives, and ultimately orchestrated one of the most shocking mass murders California had ever seen. Long before the murders, neighbors wondered about the coffins they saw being delivered to his home. They questioned why his children seemed to vanish from public view, but no one could have imagined the true horror of what was happening behind closed doors. In the end, 9 people would die, most of them children, each shot through the eye in what Wesson called sending them to the Lord. But to understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to where it all began. Marcus Wesson was born in Kansas City, Missouri, in 1946. His childhood would shape him into the monster he would become, but no one could have predicted just how far his depravity would reach. It started with a little girl named Elizabeth. She was just 8 years old when Marcus first noticed her. What happened next would set in motion 2 decades of abuse, manipulation, and ultimately murder. In the late 1960s, Marcus Wesson met Rosa Solorio, a single mother with 9 children living just a few houses down from his mother's home in San Jose, California. Rosa was struggling. Her husband had abandoned the family, leaving her to raise 9 children alone. When Marcus appeared offering help, he seemed like an answer to her prayers. But he had other motives. Among Rosa's children was 8-year-old Elizabeth. From the moment Marcus entered their lives, he began grooming this child who would become his first victim. Within months, Marcus had taken complete control of the household. He enforced strict religious practices, mandatory vegetarian diets, and harsh physical punishment for any perceived disobedience. But what no one knew was that Marcus had already begun his pattern of abuse. At night, after the household was asleep, he would molest Elizabeth, telling her they were married in the eyes of God. By the time Elizabeth was 14, Marcus had convinced Rosa to allow them to legally marry. He was 27. Elizabeth was in the 9th grade and already pregnant with their first child. Their first son, Dorian, was born in 1974. He would be the first of 11 children Elizabeth would bear for Marcus. But Marcus's twisted vision of family was only beginning to take shape. As his family grew, so did Marcus's religious delusions. He began mixing elements of vampirism with his interpretation of Christianity, declaring himself both God and a vampire. He would eventually purchase 9 coffins from an antique shop, forcing his children to sleep on them. These same coffins would later become a chilling foreshadowing of the tragedy to come. But Marcus wasn't content with just one wife. As his daughters and nieces grew older, he began grooming them just as he had Elizabeth, performing secret wedding ceremonies and claiming them as additional wives. By the late 1990s, Marcus had fathered children with his own daughters, Kiani and Sebrena, and his nieces, Sofina and Ruby. Each pregnancy was explained away as artificial insemination, while the dark truth remained hidden behind closed doors. In total, Marcus would father 18 children through his wife, daughters, and nieces. But as his family grew, so did his paranoia. And soon, he would develop a plan that would lead to unthinkable tragedy. As Marcus Wesson's control over his family deepened, his religious beliefs took an even darker turn. Inspired by David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, he became obsessed with government persecution and the end times. The 1993 standoff in Waco, Texas, became more than just news to Marcus. It became a blueprint. He forced his family to watch the coverage repeatedly, telling them that one day They too would face a similar threat, but Marcus had a plan. He called it sending them to the Lord, a suicide pact that would ensure his family would never be separated by outside forces. He designated certain family members as his strong soldiers. Among them was his daughter Sebrena, who would later play a crucial role in the tragedy to come. The coffins in their home took on new meaning. Marcus told his children they were preparing for the day when they might need to sacrifice themselves to preserve their souls from contamination by the outside world. The plan was specific and horrifying. If authorities ever tried to separate the family, the older children were to shoot the younger ones, then themselves. The target would be the eye, Marcus's chosen path to send them to heaven. In 1999, the family's dedication to this pact would be tested. While living on their boat, the Zion, suspicious vans were spotted nearby. Believing them to be government agents, the children prepared to enact the suicide pact. They dressed in clean clothes, wrote goodbye notes, and loaded the family gun. Only a last-minute phone call to Marcus, revealing the vans belonged to an insurance company, prevented tragedy that day. But Marcus was proud that his children were willing to die at his command. What no one realized was that this practice run would become a terrifying preview of what was to come. 5 years later, when the threat became real, there would be no last-minute phone call to stop it. By 2004, two of Marcus's nieces, Ruby and Sophia, had managed to escape his control. But they had been forced to leave their children behind, 7-year-olds Aviv and Jonathan. Their desperate attempt to rescue these children would trigger the very nightmare Marcus had been preparing his family for. The cracks in Marcus Wesson's control began to show when some of his children started to escape. It started with Brandy, who fled at 16. Then came Ruby and Sophia, but escape came at a terrible price. Ruby had to leave behind her daughter Aviv, and Sophia her son, Jonathan. Both children remained under Marcus's control. For years, Ruby and Sophia tried to rebuild their lives while desperately seeking a way to rescue their children. But Marcus had prepared for this very scenario. Those who remained loyal to Marcus became even more isolated. He moved the family frequently, living in converted buses, boats, and eventually a former law office in Fresno. Then in early 2004, Ruby and Sophia received alarming news. Marcus was planning to move the family to Washington State. They knew it was now or never. On March 12, 2004, they gathered family members and friends who weren't under Marcus's influence. Their plan was simple: go to the house with documentation proving their rights as mothers and demand their children back. But that morning, Elizabeth made an unexpected visit to Ruby's house. The escape plan nearly unraveled. By the time Ruby and Sophia arrived at Marcus's house with their supporters, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Family members still loyal to Marcus blocked their entry. When police arrived, they found Marcus in the doorway, refusing to release the children. He cited his rights as their father, but Ruby and Sophia had come prepared with birth certificates listing them as the mothers. As the argument escalated on the front lawn, no one noticed Marcus slip back inside. No one saw him whisper to his strong soldiers, and no one could have predicted the horror that was about to unfold. Elizabeth was the first to notice Marcus's absence. She knew what it could mean. When she entered the house and found a table pushed against the back bedroom door, her worst fears were confirmed. When Elizabeth ran screaming from the house, chaos erupted. Ruby and Sophia, knowing about the suicide pact, desperately tried to convince police that their children were in grave danger. But for nearly an hour, as SWAT teams surrounded the house, no one went inside. No shots were heard. No sounds emerged from the bedroom where Marcus had gathered his family. When police finally entered, they found Marcus, covered in blood. He surrendered without resistance. But what they discovered in the back bedroom would haunt them forever. 9 bodies, carefully arranged. Each victim shot through the eye. On top of the pile lay 25-year-old Srebrena. Beneath her, 17-year-old Elizabeth, known as Lisa. Then the children, 13-month-old Jeva, 18-month-old Sedona, 19-month-old Marshy, 4-year-old Ethan, and 8-year-old Ilabel. At the bottom lay Aviv and Jonathan, the very children Ruby and Sophia had come to save. Forensics would later reveal that the younger children were killed first. Gunshot residue on Srebrena's hands suggested she had carried out Marcus's orders before taking her own life and that of her sister Lisa. The gun was found beside them, a .22 caliber handgun. No fingerprints were recovered, but DNA evidence would tell the story of those final moments. As Marcus was led away by police, he could be seen mouthing the words "I love you" to news cameras. 9 lives had ended, but the horror of what had happened inside that house was only beginning to emerge. In the aftermath of the Fresno massacre, the full scope of Marcus Wesson's decades of abuse began to emerge. Marcus Wesson's trial began on March 3, 2005. He faced 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of sexual abuse. But what made jury selection difficult was an unexpected factor: fear. Many potential jurors had to be excused because they were too terrified to be in the same room as Marcus Wesson. Even in custody, his presence commanded a chilling power. Elizabeth was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Though still clearly under Marcus's influence, she and other family members revealed decades of abuse, incest, and religious manipulation. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Even if Marcus hadn't pulled the trigger, his years of brainwashing and preparation for this very scenario made him responsible for every death. The jury agreed. Marcus Wesson was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. Today, at 77 years old, he remains on death row at San Quentin. In 2006, the house where the murders took place was demolished. But for the survivors, the process of rebuilding their lives was just beginning. Elizabeth divorced Marcus in 2010. She went to college, strengthened relationships with her surviving children. Many of the children who escaped Marcus's control went on to pursue education and start families of their own. Some, like Gypsy, who now goes by Evelyn, have spoken publicly about surviving Marcus's cult, hoping their story might help others recognize the signs of abuse and control. 9 lives were lost on March 12, 2004. 7 children and 2 young women who never had the chance to experience life beyond Marcus Wesson's control. Their deaths serve as a tragic reminder of how religious manipulation and abuse can destroy entire families across generations